Just some high-level information about the membership of Teachers Retirement System. Teachers, administrators, specialists, et cetera, employed by public school districts in Montana are required to be members of TRS, along with some employees of a few state agencies, the community colleges, and we still have some members in the Montana university systems. We have just under 20,000 active members, about 8,000 inactive members. Those inactive members are a mix of terminated vested and terminated non-vested members, which means they have money on account with TRS, but they're currently not working. Then we have almost 18,000 retirees and benefit recipients. We serve 364 employers in the state of Montana that report to TRS with a staff of 22 FTE. On page 5, this gives you some sort of an idea of our average full-time active members. Their average salaries just at $60,000 a year. Their average age is 41 or 44 years old. Their years of service is almost 10 years, and their average hire age is 34.3. On the retired side, our average annual benefit amount is about $25,000. That comes out to $2,100 gross per month. Their current average age is 73.1 years old. They're 59.3 at retirement, so almost age 60 at retirement on average. And then the average service at retirement is just barely under 25. And in TRS, for Tier 1, you're eligible for a non-reduced benefit with 25 years of service credit or age 60. So there's always going to be some that pull that average down because maybe they started late or whatever. But I mean, it's pretty close to exactly where you'd expect it to be. All right, so the actual valuation, as you all know, our market rate of return for last fiscal year ended up pretty darn good compared to how it was looking most of the year, but we ended up at 8.3 versus a 7.3% assumed rate. So we had an actuarial gain there. Our actuarial rate of return, which is smoothed over a 4-year period, ended up at 7.66% versus that actuarial assumption. So we did end up with a small overall actuarial gain. The market value of assets are nearly identical. They're 51 million less than the actuarial value of assets, which again, the reason for that is that smoothing. Our funded ratio increased from 71.7 to 72.5%, and our amortization period decreased from 25 years to 24.
Now, Sean, you said this is on a fiscal basis.
This is on a fiscal year basis, yeah. So July 1 through June 30th. June 30th is an important day in the retirement world. That snapshot means a lot. So on page 7, here you have the bar graphs that just show, our active membership in light blue versus our retired membership in the dark blue. And you can see that we had, basically we stayed flat on active membership for the fiscal year versus last year. In our retirees grew just under 2% versus a 2.7% annual increase on average since 2008. 15 years ago, we had 1.6 active members for every retiree, and in 2023, we now have 1.1 active members for every retiree. That's not really something to be scared of. I mean, that's just a sign of a mature system. We have as you all know, the baby boomers are all retirement eligible at this point, and they have been retiring, and that's nothing to be too concerned about. That 1.1, it's still well above 1. And even once you get to 1 or 0.9, it may or may not be something to worry about. I've asked our actuary, and he said he's really not going to be too worried about it until we hit about 0.7.
Okay, but in their projections, do they get there?
No, I think a lot of those people that are currently receiving benefits will die off before you get there. Yeah.
Merry Christmas.
So,
You guys are rough.
You're basically through the baby boomers teaching, aren't you? To the very tail end of that? When you look
so
at
yeah, we have our assumed retirement rates for each year, based on their age and years of service.
But you're just about maxed up to the top.
They're pretty much plateauing, yes. Yeah. They're not still climbing, certainly. Yep. Okay, let's see. So we're on page 9, I guess. Okay, so on page 9, This is just illustrates our full-time covered payroll versus our benefit payments. And as you can see, I mean, those lines are trending the way we would want them to. We don't want there to be a threat of those ever crossing. Certainly there's not. They're both trending at the same rate. And you can see that full-time payroll, this isn't our total payroll because it doesn't include part-time members, but our full-time payroll was about 824 million and our benefit payments were 446 million. When you include our part-time members, that full-time payroll is about 980 million. It's not, I shouldn't say full-time, our overall covered payroll. It's about 980 million. Page 10 illustrates the actuarial value of assets in red versus the market value of assets. And you can see the effects of smoothing in 2021 when we had the almost 28% return year. The market value of assets was considerably higher than the actuarial value of assets. But I think that it illustrates why we utilize actuarial value for the purposes of evaluation, so you don't have sort of the kind of knee-jerk reactions. I mean, it really does smooth those returns out over the time period. So things don't ever look as good as they maybe would if you're using market, but they also don't look quite as bad as they would if you're using market. Both in 2022 and 2023, those two values were almost on top of each other. So, I mean, we really aren't getting a huge advantage one way or the other using the actuarial value versus market value. All right, on page 11, this illustrates the light blue bars are the actuarial value of assets, which you can see have grown steadily since 2013, year over year. So thank you, Board of Investments and Director Villa for that. Versus our unfunded actuarial liabilities, which are the dark blue bars on that graph. And I'll point out just a couple of things. If you look at the difference on the unfunded liability from 2017 to 2018, you'll see we were down to 1.6 billion in unfunded. We jumped up to 1.9 billion in unfunded. The reason for that was we adopted more conservative assumptions as a result of an experience study that was through June 30th, 2017. They went into effect for fiscal year 18, and those liabilities grew. And a big part of that was we reduced our actuarial rate of return assumption. So that's primarily what caused that. So then likewise, we have the ups and downs of the market. That's certainly going to affect things, but we get to 2021, 2022, we did another experience study. So for TRS, every 5 years, we do an experience study that looks at the previous 4 years plus forward-looking projections and update our assumptions. And the biggest one that moves the dial the farthest and the fastest is that rate of return assumption. So back in 2017, we were still using a 7.75% rate of return assumption. We dropped that to 7.5 in 2018. 2022, we were using that 7.5, and that has now dropped to 7.3%. But you can see it really didn't cause as big of a blip in sort of how that was trending. We pretty much stayed flat, actually reduced our liability slightly as a result of the market rate of return. In addition to rate of return assumptions that have been moved more conservatively, we also have adopted fully generational mortality tables now that are specific to the teaching profession. So that was a little bit of a hit at the time we did it. It increased our liabilities, but it puts us on much firmer ground going forward. All the work that the TRS board's done to tighten those assumptions up and make them more conservative in the long run makes the system healthier. I know my actuary feels a lot better about 24-year amortization today than he would have back in 2013, just because those assumptions are more conservative.
So it's changed to mortality assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Did it extend the ages or did it lower the ages?
At the time when we adopted these, it actually did extend the ages a little bit. And the good news is when we do an experience, I shouldn't say, it depends how you look at it, whether it's good news. But by the time we do our next experience study, I have been reading that life expectancy's actually been going down the last few years.
But they're rebounding because of COVID. They're rebounding a little bit.
Yeah, so the new assumptions, the new tables that we adopted have cooked in, I think, better gains in mortality as far as living longer. than what we're experiencing. Which is fine, it likely will result in really no change, but that's good because we're not automatically getting more liability to go with an update to those assumptions. All right, on page 12, it just sort of is numerically what happened as far as from July 1, 2022 through July 1, 2023. Again, I guess the thing I maybe would point out is our normal cost rate went down slightly, but that rate to amortize the UAL, so the UAL is the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And you can see that of the total contributions we get from the employer, about 9.36% of their contributions are going to pay that legacy unfunded liability. So that's a good position to be in. And their total rate is 11.96. So of the 11.96% the employer pays to TRS, 9.36% of that goes to pay our unfunded liability. I already talked about our actual accrued liability is always going to go up because you're always accruing more benefits. The one that we need to watch is that unfunded accrued liability, and it actually went down slightly versus the previous fiscal year. Our funded status increased, and our amortization period decreased by 1 year as we would have expected. Page 13 is just simply a graph that we're required by statute to provide to the legislature that shows progress towards 100% funding, and what that represents is from July 1, 2023 going forward, if every single assumption was perfectly met, we would be 100% funded in 2046. That's that 24-year amortization period. So with that, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm happy to answer any additional questions you might have. Yes, Maggie?
So how much is the university system additional money from for TIA CREF members? How much is that helping TRS, just out of curiosity, annually?
Oh, let me think about that. So right now the university system has a supplemental contribution where they pay 4.72% of their employees' compensation that are enrolled in the MUSRP professional plan. And that those are the people that prior to the early 90s when they switched to TI CREF would have been TRS members.
Right.
And that 4.72% and so the statute says they have to pay it off by July 1, 2033. Their portion of the unfunded liability. We update that number every 2 years. So the problem with it is every 2 years we go and the university and the legislature doesn't change that rate. You have 2 less years to pay it off, so it sort of gets exponentially out of control. But going into last session, that 4.72% would have had to bump all the way up to 13.8%. And of course, the legislature didn't take any action on that. The last time that supplemental rate was adjusted by the legislature was 2007. And I'm a little off the cuff here, but I believe that 4.72% comes out to about 13 million a year. So, roughly, at least 3 times that, they'd have to be paying closer to 39 million.
Where's the lottery profits come into the contributions?
That's a great question. That has never happened. It never did happen. I know the lottery was pitched and sold as it was going to help the teachers' retirement system. The teachers' retirement system never received any lottery funding ever, even when it was first put into place.
I was on the lottery back, there was money going to the retirement.
It would have been
And
going
then
to the general.
Derek Fever asked for it not to go there because he didn't want tainted funds from gambling.
I don't think it ever actually, I think what happened was the lottery funding, it went into the state general fund, the state general fund went into TRS. My understanding is.
That's how it goes now, is through the general fund.
Correct, and that's even back then, that's how, I know it was.
But is that the state's contribution then? Is that how that's treated in your stuff here? Or?
It's not calculated as anything to do with the Montana lottery,
No,
but I suppose you could say, along with every other tax dollar that goes in the state general fund, because the state of Montana does contribute $25 million annually to TRS to help pay off that unfunded liability, plus 2.38% of all school district salaries because and that goes back to the guaranteed annual benefit adjustments. It was an unfunded benefit increase and they didn't want the employers, the school district locals to pay for that. So the general fund pays 2.38% of their salaries.
Well, and that's about the profit allotted per year is 25 million.
The 25 million only came in 2013.
It did, yes.
That was
I
Sean's
mean,
good
that's
work.
where the profit's been running. It's gonna be above that this last year. And this next year will be higher because of higher pots, jackpots, but
The 25 million's a set number, so it's been 25 million since 13, and we had to go steal that because it didn't flow in prior to. The 2.3 did.
The 2.38% plus the 25 million comes out to about 43 million a year. That comes from the state general fund to TRS.
the schools levy an extra number 2 to go to TRS, don't they?
Yeah, so they have a non-voted levy that they do that covers their retirement fund, and what that covers is their employer contribution to TRS, yes.
Other questions? Seeing none, Sean, thank you.
Thank you.
And I know you gotta travel, so if you wanna say for riveting.
I can, actually, I'll get until about 1:45. So,
Okay, so.
I mean, it's always enlightening to listen to Dory.
It's always nice, it's always nice to go after Director Graham.
So Dory, I'll turn it over to you and then you can do your best job and turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Happy to be with you today, and we have enjoyed just a tremendous working relationship with your executive director and CIO, deputy director here, and all your staff. It has really been a wonderful working relationship. So thanks for the opportunity to do this. I'm going to try and get through it without being too redundant with regard to what Director Graham has already spoken about. But there are some kind of key elements to this, and I'm going to start right off with the first page, and that is where we see the basic retirement funding formula. Director Graham talked about it, but I'm going to tell you that the annual actuarial valuation is a financial checkup for any pension plan. It's required in statute at 19-2-405, and it provides a snapshot and baseline for evaluating the sufficiency of contributions and the funded status of a pension plan. This first slide represents that basic funding formula where contributions plus investments must equal benefits plus expenses. So in this equation, as Director Graham mentioned, if contributions plus investments are greater than benefits and expenses, the funded ratio generally improves and the amortization period decreases, strengthening a plan overall. Likewise, if the benefits and expenses are greater than the left side of this equation, the status of the plan would decline. Turning to slide number 3, we can look at some of the factors underlying that basic retirement funding equation, where C, contributions are statutory. They're set by the legislature. I is the investment portion, which varies, as you're well aware, and are performance-based. The benefits paid are about $700 million in PERS alone, and over $1 billion for our pension systems, all our systems at Empera. The expense portion is usually between 0.27 and 0.35% of payroll, which is pretty small number for the amount of money that we collect and disperse. Slide number 4 details the participants in Empera. We administer 10 distinct pension plans, 8 of which are defined benefit, 1 defined contribution, and a 457 deferred compensation plan as a supplemental voluntary retirement benefit. Empower Retirement is the record keeper for both the DC and 457 plans. You can see that we have state, local governments, that's city and county, certain employees of the university system, and these are the folks that are covered by Empera. The active employees and retirees we serve over 80,000 altogether. And again, as Director Graham explained, we have 41,492 inactives, which are terminated, vested, and non-vested members that have funds on account. 568 public employers report more than $2.5 billion in covered payroll annually to Empera, and we do this with less than 50 FTEs. We also certify 225 volunteer fire departments, and that is under the Volunteer Firefighters Compensation Act, which compensates about, or it covers about 3,500 firefighters across Montana. Next slide 5 describes the membership data for PERS alone, our largest system. And I won't read those numbers to you, but I would note that the average monthly benefit of $1,772 is hardly a golden parachute and roughly equals the average monthly Social Security benefit that people can receive. Next slide begins my comments on the valuation for PERS, again, our largest system. In 2003, the market asset returns averaged 8.35, thank you very much, versus 7.3, our expected rate of return. The actuarial asset returns averaged 7.55 versus 7.3, and that's more than expected as well. And the market value of our assets are $78,476,000, less than the actuarial value of assets. That asset valuation method being used as a 4-year smoothing where investment gains or losses are recognized over that 4-year period. The funding ratio for PERS decreased slightly from 75.01% to 74.77%, where asset losses offset potential asset gains in the future. And I would note that that 74-75% is right in there with the national averages for funded ratio for mature large pension systems.
Is there a number when you would get worried?
There's so many factors that contribute to that, Mr. Chairman. We had a game warden system that I believe didn't amortize at any period, and yet it had an 85% funded ratio. So there are just anomalies in each of these systems. They're all very different. They have different provisions. So I can't say that as a generality.
Okay.
I'm talking about PERS, the largest system being in that range. Our amortization period decreased from 32 to 28 years. And I should note that an amortization period of 30 years or less is considered to be actuarially sound. The Montana Constitution, our statutes, and our board's funding policy require Empera to bring funding legislation to the next legislative session if our plans are not actuarially sound. And we've done that a number of times, successfully and unsuccessfully. The next slide is a bar graph, and it shows our active and retired membership in PERS again. For 2023, current active membership is 29,622 and retirees total 25,468. The active membership, as you can see from the graph, the bar chart here, has been stable over the years, but the retiree population has grown at a faster rate, averaging 3% over the 15 years. This increase in retiree growth is a result of an aging planned population and the continued retirement of baby boomers who remain in the workforce. Slide 8 shows the average salary and benefits paid to PERS members and retirees since 2008. Again, note the average salary is $49,062, average annual retirement benefit $21,333. And that equates to an average monthly benefit of $1,772. So at the bottom of that slide, you can see there's been an average 2.2 annual salary increase over the last 15 years, with a 3.6 increase for 2003. Our annual wage growth assumption for PERS is 3.25%, so we beat that this year. I'm going to turn it over to Director Holohan, and he will continue our presentation and talk about some of our other systems. And of course, we'll be happy to try and answer any questions. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'll pick up on slide 9 in your packet. If you look at this slide demonstrates total PERS covered payroll in red and benefits paid in green on that graph for the last 15 years. What it shows is that total covered payroll for PERS over this period has generally continued to grow.
This past year, as Director Schwinden alluded to, we did experience an increase in covered payroll of about 103 million from the previous year, and this was mainly due to the 1,100 member increase in our active population, as well as an increase of 2.6% in average salary from last year to this year, which produced a 7.6% increase in total covered payroll from FY22 to FY23. So looking at this top red line, this is where our 3.25 payroll growth assumption comes into play. That assumption's looking at that top red line, it's expecting it to grow by that percentage. And when it does, like it did this year, and actually exceeds the assumption by roughly 4.5%, it shortens the system's amortization period to pay off unfunded liabilities, because we are bringing in more cash in the form of contributions off of that payroll than we expected to. Starting fiscal year 23, you'll note at the green line about 543 million in PERS benefits were paid, which marks an increase of roughly 26.3 million from last year, which is down from the previous year. That increase was 32 million. So we turn to the next slide, number 10. Similar slide to what you saw on Director Graham's packet. Slide 10 shows the historical value of assets for the PERS system on both a market and actuarial value going back to 2008. Market value of assets is represented by the dark blue bars going up, and the actuarial or the smooth value of assets is represented by the red line. And so again, as you've heard, to come to the actuarial value of assets, we smooth in gains, which are generally market rates of return above our assumed rate, and losses, which are those rates below it, over a 4-year period. So we don't take the full market value of assets and base the valuation results off of that value, but rather recognize 1/4 of the gain or loss in the first year. And for the next 3 years, an additional 1/4 is phased into the plan and realized. For this past year, we're sitting at an actuarial asset value of roughly 6.9 billion in assets and PERS, with a market value of roughly the same 6.9 billion. So the actuarial value of assets and the market value of assets are on equal footing, and this is due to the fact that we experienced positive investment performance this year of 8.35% after netting out admin expenses and investment fees, which was 1.05% more than expected, with a quarter of this gain, roughly 68 million, being realized in this first year, and then a quarter for the next subsequent 3 years. So what does this mean? Well, this means that if all assumptions are met moving forward using our 4-year smoothing process, this year's gain will be used to help offset last year's negative 4% rate of return, and we'll continue to recognize gains for 2024 of 96 million, followed by a loss of 192 million in FY25. And that is because the actuarial gain we experienced from our FY21 28% market rate of return rolls off and out of our actuary's 4-year smoothing process at this point in time. Then thereafter, if all assumptions are met, we'll experience a gain of 17.2 million in FY26. So suffice it to say, to offset this forecasted loss for 2025, the system will need to experience investment gains above our current assumption in order to recognize gains on an actuarial value of asset basis. So no pressure, just putting that out there.
We put it out there.
And if you look at this graph on a historical basis, going back to 2008, at the beginning of the economic crisis, you'll note the trend down in assets until 2012. Then since this time, we've really been a period of positive return with the exception of last fiscal year. And finally, the last chart at the bottom shows the investment returns on a smooth value and on a regular market return basis. And again, you'll note the 4-year phased in recognition of gains and losses at work with the difference between those two numbers. Next slide, number 11, demonstrates a comparison of PRS's actuarial assets versus the unfunded accrued actuarial liabilities of the system. And on this chart, you can see the impacts of the Great Recession in 08 and 09 on both assets and liabilities. And you'll also note outlier years in 2013, where the reforms from House Bill 454 came into effect, and again 2017 and 2022, when as a result of an experienced study, our board adopted more conservative economic assumptions related to rate of return, inflation rates, and wage growth. Then the trend from there on is an improvement in assets and relative stabilization of unfunded liabilities in subsequent years. This year, again, the PERS system benefited from an overall actuarial experience gain in the form of investment performance above our 7.3% assumed rate. And as a result, the 4-year smooth actuarial value of PERS assets increased 350 million to 6.9 billion, and the unfunded accrued actuarial liabilities of the system increased by 106 million and sits at 2.3 billion. So needless to say, by examining the historical growth reflected on this graph, the main takeaway from this slide is that we continue to have relatively healthy growth in the system's asset base in comparison to liabilities. The next slide, number 12, demonstrates the funding results of the PERS system. And I'll jump to the middle of the slide, 5 rows from the top of this chart. You'll note the statutory funding rate in PERS for this valuation recognizes a 7.9% employee contribution rate and 9.07% employer contribution rate for this past fiscal year. The employer contribution rate will continue to increase 0.1% until it sunsets at the end of this fiscal year under the 2013 reforms. So at the top of the chart, you'll see the normal cost rate for PERS has continued to decrease. Now, the normal cost rate, as a refresher, is the ongoing cost of the PERS system as measured by our actuary for providing future benefits to an active member of the plan. And this came down by roughly 30 basis points from last year, from 9.72 to 9.45%. And the decrease is reflective of the new active employees coming into the system under the less expensive benefit tier created in 2013 that has a sliding scale GABA. This is a positive development. We do anticipate the normal cost rate will continue to trend down as it has over the last few years as more retirees are replaced with new members entering the system in this cheaper tier. Now, the difference between 9.72 and 9.45% is what helps pay down and amortize the unfunded liability of the PERS system. So in essence, as the normal cost rate goes down, that additional portion of the statutory contribution rate can be used to pay down unfunded liabilities. And as a result of this and the 1/10 increase in the employer contribution rate, the rate available to pay down the unfunded liabilities of the system increased by 37 basis points to 7.58%. Another positive development. You'll also note the amortization period decreased from 32 years to 28 years due to the growth in actuarial assets, the large increase in our covered payroll, and the fact that the rate to amortize these unfunded liabilities, again, increased by those roughly 40 basis points. Finally, you'll note on this slide that the unfunded liabilities of PERS went up by about $100 million, which we do expect to increase every year with our plan being a mature one. More active members of the baby boomer generation crossing the retirement finish line with vested 3% GABA rights. But again, our assets increased by about $350 million. So unfunded liabilities went up, but assets went up more, and our funded ratio remained largely on plane with the previous year's valuation. Turn to the next slide, number 13. This provides a summary for you of the valuation numbers for all of our other defined benefit plans that we administer at Empira. And so as a result of strong investment performance this year, as well as OTO money distributed to the Highway Patrol system, our Sheriff's Retirement System, and our Game Warden system, under the provisions of House Bill 569 passed this last session, each system listed on this slide has improved its amortization period for its unfunded liabilities from last valuation. And in fact, this year is the first year since 2008 that each defined benefit system is considered actuarially sound under Montana state law and is amortizing its unfunded liabilities in 30 years or less. Starting at the top.
There.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what we're supposed to do.
Yeah. You're not gonna sing, are you?
No, never.
Moscow has an interpretive dance.
Starting at the top, the judge's retirement system, of course, remains extremely well funded at over 180%, with, of course, an amortization period of 0. And under the provisions of HB 569, layered amortization has been instituted for this system this fiscal year. And as a result of the system's funded status, there is no employer contribution rate. And we do anticipate this will remain that way for some time to come because the system does have a very healthy $60 million reserve. The Highway Patrol Officers' Retirement System's funded ratio increased to 67%. Its amortization period dropped from 47 to 25 years. And this was largely a direct result of the OTO money paid to the H-Boards Trust of $27.6 million under House Bill 569. Sheriff's Retirement System's funding status sits at 78%. Its amortization period dropped from 33 to 25 years. And this was, again, a direct result of the OTO money paid to that trust fund of $26.8 million. Moving on to the Game Warden system, that funded status sits at 82%. Its amortization period dropped from does not amortize at all under any time frame to 25 years. And this, again, was a direct result of the OTO money paid into that trust fund under the provisions of House Bill 569 to the tune of $41.2 million. The Municipal Police Officers' Retirement System increased its funding status from 71 to 72, and its amortization period dropped from 24 to 21 years. Firefighters' Unified Retirement System increased its funding status from 81% to 82. Its amortization period decreased by 2 years from 12 to 10. Then finally, our Volunteer Firefighters Compensation Act, which we administer as an IRS tax qualified length of service award plan, increased its funding status from 91 to nearly 100%, 98%, and its amortization period decreased from 4 years to 1 year. We turn to the next slide. This will defer from Director Graham's presentation because we have new provisions applying to 3 of our public safety systems coming out of this last legislative session. So this next slide, number 14, displays the 4 systems that have now or will be instituting a layered amortization funding policy for all future years. So under the provisions of HB 569, the Judges Retirement System instituted this policy for this fiscal year. And of course, without having any unfunded liabilities, the ADEC, the actuarially determined employer contribution rate, is 0%. The remaining 3 systems, our highway patrol system, our sheriffs and game wardens, will have a modified layered amortization policy instituted in FY25 with an actuarially required employer contribution rate determined by the system's actuary for this upcoming year based upon the results of this most recent valuation. And the reason why I say modified is due to the fact that there is a 0.5% cap placed on any employer contribution rate increase from year to year in these systems, regardless of what our actuary comes up with in terms of ADEC rate and evaluation. You'll note in the second column the total legacy liability for each of these 3 systems. The third column lists remaining payments to be paid, and under the provisions of HB 569, the legacy liabilities are to be funded using a closed 25-year amortization period. You'll also note the current statutory contribution rate for each system in the 4th column, as well as what our actuary has calculated to be the actuarially determined employer contribution rate for FY25. And you'll see that due to the OTO dollars paid into each system's trust fund under HB 569, the rate calculated by our actuary is much less than this year's current statutory rate for each of these 3 systems. So one point I do want to bring to this board's attention is that we anticipate, as I said earlier, an actuarial loss if all assumptions are met in fiscal year 25 in our highway patrol system of 5 million, our sheriff's system of 12.9 million, our game warden system of 7.4, even if all assumptions are met. So should that happen, there is a likelihood that the ADEC rate determined by our actuary for subsequent years will be higher than that permitted by the 0.5% limitation from year to year under current law. And so that means that any new funding shortfall will be added to what's known as the contemporary liability of each system accrued from year to year under the provisions of HB 569. And they will have to be paid off over a closed 10-year amortization period corridor.
Bill, just,
Why don't I?
this is where the next 2 years in pension world is gonna be spent for this board, because we're gonna have fewer contributions coming in with additional requirements for funding. The deal, tell me if that's the wrong phrase, but that's the deal, was the Association of Counties would support layered amortization if it wasn't fully amortized. There was a cap on the increases. So I don't need to say, I tell this board this all the time, it's either property taxes or investment income. Those are the 2 things that pay for the pensions. And particularly with these systems, sheriffs are all local, highway patrol is gas tax, and game wardens, police officers blend of property tax, game wardens all general fund. But basically what has happened is the deal that MACO and the bill sponsor struck is, in order to get layered amortization implemented, they had to put a cap on the increases. Well, the cap on the increases will result, at least in this next year, in reduced contributions toward the liability. So they, within a month of the bill taking effect, they broke the 3 systems.
One other point I'd make is that there is no cap on how low the contribution rate can get. So as you see on this slide, we're dropping our contribution rate, but there was no floor put in the bill to say, you can't go below what's currently being paid, but you can only go 0.5% above. So
We worked with this bill sponsor, I think, from the first week of legislative session until the last day of the legislative session. And this bill is not drafted in the form that we would have drafted it, nor the form that our actuary recommended. So here we are.
That's very diplomatic, the way you phrase that.
Thank you. We did get $100 million of OTO money,
Yeah. So
which we had talked to the
Yeah.
budget office and executive well before the session started. But good points, Director.
All right, so the final slide, if you turn to it, number 15, the same as you saw on Director Graham's package, shows our progress towards 100% funding on the largest plan, PERS. It's depicted here as a representation that if all of our assumptions are met, PERS will advertise in 28 years and be 100% funded. I know I spoke fast, so I will stop there.
Trying to get Sean on.
Pause
the
for
roll.
questions. We get thousands of pages of evaluation reports that we have to distill into about 12 or 15 slides, so I apologize if I move quick.
Well, I think it's great since I've been here the first time. You're legally how you should be. So even though there's problems and you can see the problems, that's a real accomplishment.
We certainly spiked the football this year.
Thanks to this teamwork.
So one of the things I always like to know, part of Dan's review is that he gets along with you guys and other constituents. You said you had a good working relationship with us. Is there anything that the board should know or the board could do better to help you in your job?
You know, I think we've had the good fortune, happenstance, or whatever, for all four of us to have worked in many different venues over the years. So we've all had different hats on and from time to time. Sometimes we've had some conflicting kinds of policy discussions and all the rest. But the fact is that our communication is, it couldn't be any better. We talk all the time. Your staff here is very responsive when we're down at the accounting level and talking about the nuts and bolts of how these systems work and what the interplay is. We work it out every time. So I really don't have a constructive criticism. I'd just say, you've got a good deal going here. Your board has been super and we really like working with the team that you have.
Would you concur?
I would, I mean, as Dory stated, we really do work hand in hand, BOI, TRS, and Impera, all three of us on a lot of these issues that come up, whether it be during the legislature or the interim. I would say both from the perspective of the organization that manages our investments as well as a landlord. BOI has been very responsive to any need we've ever had, other than my personalized parking spot. But yeah, we can talk about that later. No, it actually has been really good, which I expected it to be, based on knowing all the players beforehand. But we really do work well together, and I think we put up the right front when we face adversity. So yeah, I think it's great. And thanks to John, we actually make money.
And we expect him to continue to do that.
I do tend to get a lot of emails around that 6:30 date. A lot more communication all of a sudden.
Where we at?
Yeah. Any other questions for these guys where they're still here? Well, if not, we appreciate you coming. I know it's a requirement in law, but it makes it clear. And at least from my point of view, I like the way government is set up where we primarily do the investments and you do the things that you do. I'd hate to think some systems work with it all together. It would be tough. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll take about a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and start with RVK.
All righty, you're on.
Okay, we'll call the board back together here. We're making some good progress here. And so the next thing is tab 7, RVK's presentation. We'll see how many times Jim's got to interrupt you, but good luck, Paige.
I think we put him on mute, right? Good Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I do have Jim Voitko on the line as well. He'll be adding in some comments throughout the presentation. I'm going to start on page 11 in tab 7. It says Capital Markets Review in the upper left-hand corner. So I'll take you through an economic update as of September 30th, and then also, given that we're halfway into December, I'll give you some updates since then.
Well, let me interrupt there for a moment. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Jim, I thought you would last a little longer.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding, Paige. You go right ahead.
Wow. Okay, so the third quarter of 2023, overall, you can see if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of this page where it says market performance, we did see negative performance for most of the major asset classes. The few exceptions you can see there, the ICE, B of A, that's cash. So we actually have cash with a positive return of almost 1.5% for the quarter, which is notable given where we've been for the last several years with the near zero interest rates. We did also have positive performance from a hedge fund index and then also from commodities. So what was driving that negative performance in the third quarter? We just continued to live in this world of uncertainty, essentially, both on the economic front, continued, geopolitical instability. In addition, to add some fun on top of that, we were dealing with a US debt rating, a possible shutdown of the government, which was averted in the end. But in short, the market does not like instability. It does not like surprises. So having all these unknowns contributed to a pretty volatile third quarter. That being said, we did continue to see fairly positive economic data hit the market. So overall, we've seen inflation has been trending down. Unemployment has been trending down. Consumer confidence, consumer spending remains on the high end of things. So you might be wondering if everything is good, why did the markets not like that? So if you remember where we're kind of at in this federal rate cycle of everything, we've been living in a rate hike cycle. And the big question has been, how long does that cycle continue? Does the Fed continue to take interest rates higher? Are they going to pause for a while? Are we going to see a time when they start to cut interest rates again? And essentially, the market just wants to know what's going to happen there. We don't want to continue to live in this area of everyone feeling whiplashed and not really knowing what direction we're going to go. So for the last, I'm going to call it a year, just to generalize, it seems like anytime we get positive economic news, we've seen a negative reaction from the market, because no one wants to go into this era of they're going to start cutting rates. Because, on one hand, it is good if they're cutting rates. If I'm taking out a mortgage, that's going to be cheaper. If I'm a corporation trying to roll over debt, lower rates are going to make everything cheaper. But why would they start cutting rates? Theoretically, we'd be in a recession if the Fed's going to be bringing things down. So there's kind of these two factors that are conflicting with each other, and that's driven a lot of what we've seen in the markets this year. So jump forward to where we are today, and I'm going to reference the Treasury yield curve on the bottom right-hand corner of this page. So we are currently, or as of September 30th, the green line represented the Treasury yield curve there. So you can see that the short end hovering around 5.5%. With the long end of the curve represented by 30-year treasuries here, a little below 5%. So we did continue to have an inverted yield curve as of the end of the third quarter. That being said, it was less so inverted than it was as of June 30th, so represented by the blue line on that treasury yield curve. Overall, that's a good thing. If we're thinking of investors who are going out and buying long-term Treasury bonds, you want to be compensated if you're going to take on the risk of holding that longer asset. So in a perfect or a normal world, we'd see the Treasury yield curve upward sloping across the entire duration. We have not been in that world for a while. We've had the inverted yield curve, which is more or less a warning sign that the market is out of whack, and that we're potentially going to see a recession at some point in time. So the Federal Reserve is actually meeting tomorrow. Well, they started meeting today. They'll come out with a decision tomorrow on whether they're going to hike rates again, they're going to pause, or they're going to cut rates. Consensus seems to be that they're going to pause at this meeting. I think it's very, very, very unlikely that they raise. I would also be very surprised if they decided to do a cut tomorrow. So kind of like pumping the brakes, seeing how the economic data continues to come in, is inflation going to continue to trend downward? Those are all things that they're going to be looking at when they're making that decision and when they're putting out their projections. Looking forward into 2024, John and I were talking about this before the meeting. It's, projections are all over the board. The Fed themselves are calling for one rate cut in 2024. The markets are pricing in somewhere between 4 and 5 rate cuts at the moment. And depending on which financial shop you're looking at, they could be projecting anywhere from, 1 cut to 10 cuts. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see how everything plays out there. I think it's pretty safe to say, though, that we are going to be moving into a different economic cycle than we've been in this last year. And the focus is going to be much more on how do we moderate back into a more normal interest rate environment over the long term. And the Fed's going to be working to manage that. So again, crystal ball, I don't know where we're going to be. Jim probably doesn't know where we're going to be. But I would think that sometime over the next, call it several years, we're hopefully somewhere in the middle of this Treasury yield curve chart. So we're probably not going to be back, hopefully, not going to be back at the brown line, which is, that near 0% rate. We're hopefully not going to be up at the 6%. Maybe we land somewhere between the 2 and 4% range on the short end. And then we hopefully see the yield curve return to a more normal shape, which is good for investment opportunities. I'll pause there for any questions, or Jim, if there's anything you wanted to add that I may have missed.
Because that's kind of what CD rates are doing. Your short term are coming down and they're going out longer.
Exactly.
So you're getting a flatter
Yeah.
line for
Yeah.
time being.
Yeah, and I think especially when you're dealing with an institutional investor, or you look at pensions, long-term investors, we have a lot of investors who want that longer-term opportunity set, but no one's wanted to dip their toes in that water necessarily. When I can earn the same rate on a 2-year treasury that I can get on a 30-year treasury, I'm not being compensated for that risk, and it's all risk versus return at the end of the day.
And mortgage rates have dropped just slightly too, haven't they?
I think they've come down 1% maybe in the last few months. I've seen
So
that.
I mean, that kind of
Yeah.
indicates what you're seeing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and that's its own tricky thing, right? I mean, the housing market's been so crazy the last several years, but now it's kind of going to be everyone who didn't get into something in the last several years, rates are going to come down, but every projection I've seen is that prices are going to go through the roof again. Just with demand flooding the market, people can afford, to take out a mortgage now, and that will drive a lot of demand on the price side. And that's we should probably talk about that. The real estate market in general, over the last year and in 2023, that's been a really weak spot when we're looking at the market in general. So if you look at real estate being comprised of 2 different components, you've got your income component and then your price component. So income, I'm a landlord, I'm collecting rent from whoever's renting out my building. That's remained more or less stable. Rents have kind of stabilized and been where they've been. You're going to continue to collect that income from your renter. We have seen pretty significant decreases on the appreciation side of things. Office in particular continues to be a really weak sector in the overall real estate market. The whole return to work, companies reevaluating if they're going to need as much office space, if they're going to maybe look to downsize and use some kind of hoteling model to bring employees back into the office. A lot of that remains up in the air, but we have seen pretty significant vacancy rates going through the roof for office and stuff like that.
A lot of things are under long-term leases, so you don't see it yet,
Yeah.
but it's whatever's coming up seems to be
Right.
vacancy rates. Yeah.
And even anecdotally, I think we shared this when everyone was in Boise, we're actually moving offices at the end of the year, and our landlord essentially was unwilling to compromise or to negotiate on the lease that was in place. And vacancy rates are pretty high in the building, and management essentially said, okay, well, if you're not going to work with us, we're going to go try and make a deal with someone else.
And we did. And our current landlord came back and said, gee, can you if you want to stay longer, we'll keep you in here month by month with no increase in rate at all, but it was too late. So anyway, but I would emphasize the word that my colleague used, normalization. That normalization that you see in the yield curve has already started. It is less inverted than it was previously. The long end, where the Fed has the least control over rates, has become somewhat more normalized. And so the issue then is what happens at the short end and when it happens. And I think the weakness in the market is largely a debate among investors over how long short rates can stay at this rate. And interestingly enough, as Paige put it, the more good news there is, the more reason the Fed has not to cut rates, that these rates are normal in the sense that they're not restricting economic activity, with the significant exception of housing, which definitely has been hit. The other thing I would point out is in this table on this page, you notice that the break-even rate for 10 years on the TIPS, this is an indication, a reasonable indication, it's not totally accurate, of the real return or the inflation rate that's expected for the economy, that is reflected in what people are willing to pay for TIPS, has risen, but it has stabilized about 16 points lower at the end of September than our 2.5% long-term assumptions. So that's built into our capital market assumptions. So that's been an indication that that the current yield on intermediate and longer term bonds is actually reflecting a real return to investors in fixed income that they haven't seen for a long, long time. So I think that all these things are incrementally edging toward normalization. That doesn't mean that rates go back down at the short end to 1 or 2%. That seems unlikely right at the moment, but they could come down at some point when the Fed feels it can do it, either because inflation is so solidly under control, which it's not yet, it's still above 3%, or the soft landing turns into something a little more hard, and the Fed feels it has to cut rates. So I'll stop there. Go ahead, Paige.
Thanks, Jim. So I guess to talk a little more about where the markets have gone since the end of September 30th, essentially everything has gone up, which is good. So we've seen positive performance for most of the major asset classes. The S&P 500 index, the Dow Jones have been hitting all-time highs in terms of the performance we're seeing there, breaking the previous records that were set, I think, in March of 2022. So the market has been reacting really positively to the news that's been coming out. In the equity markets, we continue to see technology really dominating a lot of the gains, a lot of buzz around AI, and companies who may or may not have access to that technology. And I think that will continue to be a theme that we see over the next year as we move forward into 2024. So in terms of your portfolio, you should see positive returns from everything that we're presenting you today. And unless there is some kind of catastrophic market event in the last 2 weeks of the year, we'll expect you'll finish in positive territory for calendar year 2023.
So that's the same with international markets?
Correct.
And real estate market?
Real estate, we don't have numbers on because they only release the performance on a quarterly basis. I would be surprised if we saw a positive performance out of real estate through the end of the year, but I can't say for certain what the data will say for the fourth quarter.
We were down 1.5% in real estate as of yesterday.
Yeah, I would say high level, not to steal Ethan's thunder, he can get into it a little bit later, but we've seen things start to stabilize a little bit in most sectors, office maybe being somewhat still the exception, although even there I would say, a little more stable. But I think probably the key point, as Ethan and I have talked about it, is that there's not a lot of trades going on in the market right now, so it's difficult to determine exactly where pricing is. And I think even though let's say the broader market starting to stabilize to where maybe we'll start picking up a few more transactions. I don't know that pricing, I don't think that pricing probably has rippled through our portfolio entirely at this point, although we have taken, much of that pain at this point, so.
Okay.
Probably modest declines from here in the portfolio would be my guess.
I'm going to flip forward to page 16, so forward about 3 or 4 pages here, cover one more chart on the capital markets front. The title here is Annual Asset Class Performance. We call this our quilt chart because the data tends to look like a quilt, the way that it's presented. Again, I think this just highlights pretty well the themes that we've seen in 2023, and these themes carry through into your portfolio as well. So each asset class is represented by a color on this chart. If you focus on the farthest right column that says YTD at the top, that represents year to date. The top performing asset classes for this year, this is as of September 30th, but this does more or less remain true through where we are today, is large cap US equities and large cap developed international equities. It's also notable that you see the gray box from the top here. Again, that's cash with a year-to-date return of 3.6% in this chart. Again, I just think that's worth highlighting given where we've been. We're in just a different dynamic where if you're holding on to a little bit of cash in your portfolio, has been additive instead of being a cash drag necessarily. In terms of the bottom performing asset classes, no surprise, in the dark yellow here, we have real estate, negative 7.6% for the year. And right above that in the light orange color, that is long-term US government bonds. So that has been the one segment of the fixed income market that we have seen sustained negative performance from this year, given the way the rate curve has been moving. So let's get into some MBOI specific returns here. I'm going to start on page 4, flipping forward to the next report. This is Montana Board of Investments asset allocation retirement plans in the upper left corner. So this is just a snapshot as of September 30th. So you can see about $13.8 billion represented in the retirement plans. PERS and TRS are the two largest components of the retirement plans, representing about 80% of the assets that are included here. I'm going to skip page 5 and move ahead to page 6. It says comparative performance in the upper left-hand corner for the retirement plans. So this is both trailing and calendar year performance for each of the retirement plans individually. Looking at the net of fees return, representing the return you're actually able to take home at the end of the day there. For the third quarter of 2023, we did see a negative return overall, not surprising given the negative returns that we did see from the individual asset classes. However, we always like to focus on the long-term performance on these pages. If you look out over the 7, 10, 20-year time period, I'm looking at the PERS return in the first line item as an example. You see a 10-year return of 7.47% and a 20-year return of 7.18%. So over the long term, portfolio returns continue to be strong. We're also seeing outperformance relative to the benchmarks that you have in place for each of these plans. So again, looking at those 7 and 10-year time periods for PERS, outperformance of 84 basis points and 36 basis points, which is really strong. This is an annualized number. So for each of those years in there, we're seeing outperformance relative to those benchmarks in place. So I guess the punchline here would be is that your asset allocation strategy has been really successful, gaining that total fund net of fees return of about 7.5%. And then the managers that you have in place relative to your benchmarks have also been doing a strong job of outperforming relative to their benchmarks there. We do have each of the line items detailing each of the retirement plans, very similar performance. I don't think we really need to get into that unless there's any specific questions from the board. Awesome, I'll keep moving. So I'm going to flip forward to page 9 then. This details again that comparative performance for each of the retirement plans. We've also included here rankings relative to the peer universe. So this is other more or less retirement plans who have a general asset size that is similar to yours. So if I'm picking out the PERS, the gross performance line, relative to peers for the quarter, you did rank in the 46th percentile, and we can talk in a minute about what drove that rank relative to your peers. If you look out over the longer trailing time periods, though, I'm going to start with 5 years. So you're ranking in the 20th percentile, the 17th percentile, the 5th, and the 25th for those respective time periods. That is top quartile performance all over all those time periods. For those board members who attended the training we did in Boise a few months ago, we talked about we don't necessarily want to be the first ranking member in the peer group. We also don't want to be the 100th ranking member. It's the sweet spot is kind of to be in that, top quartile to above median. And you have accomplished that more or less if we look at the calendar year time periods, ranking in the various of increments of the 30s and the 40s. Which has resulted in much higher trailing performance because you've been able to maintain that strategy over time, which is compounding you into a higher return relative to your peers.
Yeah, you can, that we downplay peer ratings because we don't think they're as important as absolute returns, because that's what you take. You wrest from the marketplace if they're there to pay benefits, and your performance versus benchmark gives you the best clue as to how well you're executing your strategy. Peer rankings don't have zero value at the total fund level, but they're not as important. But I think I've mentioned in prior meetings that we adhere to the Zen concept. And the Zen concept is that, as Paige alluded to, the way to be a top quartile or a top decile fund is to more consistently than not simply be above median. If you're above median in most years, then the accumulation of those years moves you ahead of peers because other peers are more volatile than you are. And so your track record over the long run and over the intermediate run is really quite strong. You should be very proud of it in all respects, as Paige has mentioned. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. The last comment I was going to make on page 9 here, so on the bottom half of the page, this represents your asset allocation relative to your peers in the peer group. So on a composition basis, how are you allocated relative to the other members in the peer group? Overall, you tend to be fairly in line with the other members of the peer group. The major observation being here that you do have a higher allocation to real estate than the other members of the peer group, which has obviously been very beneficial to the performance of the portfolio over the longer term. For the calendar year to date and for the quarter, that was a small drag on your performance, just with where the real estate market has been. But that being said, we're not recommending any kind of move away from that. It's a long-term strategic allocation to this asset class that has done a really, really good job for you historically. I'm going to flip forward to page 12 here. So moving forward to look at this performance on, the two components we like to talk about in conjunction with each other being risk and return. So this is over the trailing 10-year time period as of September 30th. PERS with a return of 8.06 and a standard deviation of 7.82. If you look at the bars, so the red line going up and down, it represents risk in this chart, and the red line going horizontal across the page represents return. The ideal placement in this chart is to be in that upper left quadrant, because that means you are earning a higher return than the median peer member in this universe while doing it with taking on less risk, which is something that you've managed to do over this time period. So each of the gray dots on the scatter plot represent a member in the peer universe, and the red lines represent the median. So very pleased with that performance and with the risk measures that you've taken to earn that return. Focusing on a few of the metrics on the bottom of the page here. So standard deviation, again, representing the volatility of the portfolio. So all things being equal, we would like to earn a certain return with as low of an amount as volatility as we can take on, right? So your standard deviation over the last 10 years, that's this figure of 7.82. That is quite a bit less than the benchmark that you have in place. So you've been able to implement your asset allocation strategy with lower volatility than what the public market indexes would suggest that you would be able to. And you've also been able to have slightly lower volatility again than those other members in the peer group. This plays directly into the Sharpe ratio. So looking to the right of that standard deviation, you do have a really strong Sharpe ratio for the trailing 10-year time period. So this is the risk-adjusted return, essentially, your portfolio has earned. So a figure of 0.88, which is higher, again, than your implementation benchmark of 0.61, which ranks you in the 20th percentile relative to peers. In this instance, it is better to have a higher Sharpe ratio, and it is better to rank lower relative to your peers. So you're in the top quartile for your Sharpe ratio relative to your peers there. I'm happy to talk about any other stats on this page, but I don't want to bore anyone to death with the risk stats, so I can keep moving unless there's any questions here. All right, let's flip forward to page 15. So just a quick snapshot of the asset allocation for CAP. So again, you have about half of your portfolio, maybe a little more, in equity. That's represented by the green slice of the pie, the dark blue private investments, which is comprised of both private equity and private credit. So there is a little bit of private fixed income in there, as well as international equity in the yellow slice here. So when we look at your overall portfolio, these are the three asset classes that more or less should be driving your return over the long term. And then you have the other half of the pie, which is comprised of core fixed income, real estate, non-core fixed income, real assets, and cash. Page 16, this is the last slide that I'll focus on today, just giving you an overview of the individual asset class components and how they contributed to performance over the quarter. And again, we're going to look at over the longer time periods as well. So you can see, looking at the quarter to date and fiscal year to date column, the first one farthest to the left on the page, we did see negative performance from most of the underlying asset class composites in the third quarter. The three exceptions were real assets with a positive return of 0.6%, cash with a positive return of 1%, and private investments with a positive return of 1.1%. We always caveat with those private asset classes, that's private investments and real assets, both, that there is a lag effect there. So we really don't want to focus too much on the short-term performance number we're seeing on the page. If we look out over the longer time periods, again, this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about in terms of the asset allocation. So your asset classes have done what we would expect them to do. So if I look at domestic equity and international equity, I'm going to focus on the 10-year time period here. Domestic equity has been your second highest asset class return over that time period, generating a return of just under 11%. We have seen positive performance from international equity, albeit to a lesser degree, 3.6%. This largely just has to do with the US equity markets have been very strong over the prior 10-year time period. We do expect to see a reversal of this to some degree over the next 10-year time period, as we see valuations continue to be very high on the US side, a little more opportunity set on the international equity side, which is why we're recommending that you maintain, long-term exposure to both of these asset classes. Looking down it, I'm going to skip to the bottom temporarily, private investments. Over that 10-year time period, your absolute highest asset class return at 13.2%. So again, this asset class consists of both private equity and private credit, and has been very additive to overall portfolio performance. Another benefit here has been, we've seen maybe in periods where the public equity markets have gone down, we've seen some resilience in the private markets, and there's been a strong diversification effect as valuations smooth out across those asset classes.
Yeah,
Okay.
if I could mention something about private investments, around the country, public funds are under somewhat of an attack in many jurisdictions because private investments are your most expensive fees. You saw that in your CEM report. It's a fact of life that's inescapable at the moment. and it has to be lived with. But then the interesting thing is that if you go to that 10-year column, go across the bottom rows in private investment to that column, you see that, as Paige pointed out, it is the highest returning asset class that you have had for the last 10 years, over 13%. But most importantly, it is almost 2.2% above what you would have earned had you been put those assets in the public markets. And what that means is that there is a premium, and it has been anyway, for being in private investments even after you pay those fees. And over 200 basis points annualized turns out to be an awful lot of money to fund benefits. So we don't like, as consultants, we're on the client side, we don't like high fees. And if we could figure out a way to get around them, we would. But what we do like is that if you have to pay these fees to get these exposures, that you get a return that is commensurate to the fees you have to pay. And in this particular case, the net of fees gain over the last 10 years has been significant for almost all of our clients who have been invested in private equity and private investments generally. That's no guarantee of the future, but it is something that I think a lot of the critics don't really appreciate, that the illiquidity premium for being in private investments and in that large portion of the economy that is not publicly traded has been substantial and can't be ignored. So I'll stop there.
That's a great point. Thank you, Jim. So just a few more asset classes to cover here, looking at core fixed income as well as non-core fixed income over the 10-year time period. Generally we think of fixed income as serving this role of capital preservation. So if you think of your equity assets as being appreciation assets, you want your fixed income to be preservation assets. So I simplify that to, did I make money? And you did within the core fixed income. So that's a positive return of 1.2% over the trailing 10 years. I would add that non-core fixed income has been a helpful component to your portfolio to diversify away from just those core assets. So within your non-core fixed income, that is strategies such as high yield fixed income, emerging markets debt, convertibles, and preferred fixed income. So essentially you still have these fixed income assets, but you're diversifying away from just being really in the straight bond market, and you're able to earn a little more yield for the portfolio without necessarily taking on the full risk of additional equity assets and the risk that comes with those assets. Looking at real assets and real estate is the last two to focus on this page. Real assets being a newer asset class, so we'll look at the 5-year time frame. A positive return of just under 5% for that 5 years. I think it's notable in this one instance to look at shorter time periods just to kind of see the impact we've seen living through this extra inflationary environment. Real assets has been very beneficial to your portfolio. Generally speaking, real asset investments respond very positively to being in an inflationary environment. So you can see over the trailing 3-year time period, real assets were actually your second highest performing asset class, outpaced only by the private investments. So again, just a really nice diversifier to the overall portfolio, and has brought some good income in for you as well. Real estate being the last asset class on this page. Again, if you look at the shorter time periods, calendar year to date, 1 year, we do see negative returns. Again, that is more just a function of the struggles of that market in particular lately. If you look out over the longer trailing time periods, which include, this negative performance that's being deducted from the very positive performance that's still shown here, nearly 9% positive return over the prior 10 years, and has been very additive to the portfolio performance for you. That concludes the comments I have prepared for today. I'm happy to take any further questions from the board.
I've got one for you.
Sure.
We don't spend a lot of time usually on investment managers. We get a lot of that from John, I think. Yep. But in looking at our various array of things, and you put some of their metrics here in our book, could you just comment on how that's working for us, or talk about managers a little.
Sure. So we do review this on a regular basis. There are no managers that we have flagged as of this moment that we have concerns with. I know John and his staff can add a lot of commentary about any specific manager. You might have a question on there.
I'm not really worried about specific ones. I just wanted to, since that's a big part of your book,
Sure.
just to have a comment on how those are looking there.
I think
So
everything's,
assuming you did have an issue with those, I know sometimes that's hard in a public forum.
sure.
But you do review those and talk with John about those, and I know you have a list of concerning managers or whatever over time that has been helpful, so.
Yeah, so I guess I would maybe just add some color. We do monitors, like a several prong approach here, and we're looking at these managers on an ongoing basis. The first obviously being quantitative, so looking at the performance purely relative to the benchmark. Are the managers meeting the objectives that we're asking them to meet? And that is something that's monitored on a quarterly basis. In addition to more frequently, if we see a strong deviation from what we expect from that manager's style. In addition to that, we're on an ongoing basis monitoring any organizational updates that come out from your specific managers. So that could be something like losing a portfolio manager, maybe some kind of CEO, CIO, management turnover to some degree. If we see any kind of large layover announcement come out from any of these managers, that is something that we're monitoring. We'll often shoot an email over to staff and touch base if we see any of those updates come out that we are concerned with. So we definitely have eyes on it and are in contact with staff frequently about any manager updates we feel need to be communicated.
Yeah, I would add that when your question, which you posed often, is a good one, and Paige's answer is exactly right. We monitor all these managers, and we're in communication with your staff, and your staff does, I would say, compared to our 200 plus clients, a more detailed manager review in terms of continuity and depth than by far than the average institutional fund out there. First of all, this board has equipped them with the resources to do so, and their protocols are strong. But I would add to that when we look for problems, and we do because we work for the board, we look for things in the portfolio that aren't doing well, and we try to understand, is this something of a concern, or is it driven by market conditions, or is it driven not by managers, but maybe by the construct that has been chosen for the mandates? So you've heard John often say, with respect, for example, for your high yield mandate, that you've deliberately chosen more conservative managers so that in rapidly rising markets, they're not going to perform as well as the benchmark. But that's by design. And so it's more than just whether or not the manager is beating the benchmark or not. That's a matter of arithmetic. It's also asking the question, what am I asking this manager or this group of managers to do inside a set of mandates that the board staff has constructed, either to be more conservative or more aggressive? So when you look at something as you do on page, for example, page 16, and you look at non-core fixed income, you can see versus the benchmark, these are not terribly attractive numbers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the managers you've selected are doing a terrible job. It may mean that, but it goes beyond, the answer to the question goes beyond just looking at an individual manager. So I'll stop there. I hope John agrees with that in general anyway.
I do. Anything else for us, Paige?
I'll maybe just leave you with a compliment to wrap things up. I'm just thinking through this question a little more. I think that your staff and your board have done a very nice job of concentrating your active management dollars and your active management decisions in an intentional way. So what do I mean by that? When we're talking about evaluating and monitoring managers, you're entirely passively implemented within your domestic equity portfolio. So when we're monitoring, are these passive managers tracking the benchmarks we expect them to? There is not a ton of oversight required beyond that, barring some kind of huge organizational change. So being able to focus in on asset classes that we believe to be more inefficient and therefore active managers have a better chance of outperforming. International equity and non-core fixed income being two examples there. I think it streamlines the process a bit and enables everyone to be to have that oversight that's required and to also be able to make just really intentional decisions when manager changes are being made in those asset classes.
I may get in trouble for this, but Jim, do you have anything else for us?
I think I am owed a cookie for not using any metaphors this meeting. That's
Well, that was a previous chairman. That's got nothing to do with it.
I'll eat one for you, Jim.
not exactly what I had in mind, but okay.
Well, thank you. We appreciate the work you do, and encourage you to keep up in good communication with all of us, and especially with the staff. So thank you. So I think we can move on, John, and I can turn everything over to you to tab 8 and see what we can do.
Sounds good, Mr. Chairman. So as you said, I'm on tab 8. I'll start on slide 4, the CIO update here. I won't spend a ton of time on a lot of this because Paige covered a lot of it well, but some of the main economic indicators maybe that we look at here on slide 4. Most of these have been slowing. The market has been increasingly optimistic, I guess I will say, about the so-called soft landing, if you will. So sort of the no recession or very minor or brief recession possibility. We did get some updated inflation data this morning for CPI, and that is certainly one of the key metrics that the Fed's looking at to determine whether or not they're going to continue to raise rates or not. So November CPI this morning came in right kind of at expectations, 3.1% for the headline number, 4% for CPI ex food and energy, which is probably the main metric that the Fed really looks at. So as Paige and Jim, I think, stated, 4% for CPI ex food and energy, it's certainly come down significantly, but not at a level yet where I think the Fed would say, well, this is well under control, as they would want it more in that 2% range. So moving to slide 5, I've showed this chart before, but it continues to remain relevant. In inflation, you can see that it's coming down, coincident with the Fed raising rates over the last year plus or so here. They've sort of been on pause. I would agree with Paige's assessment that I think it's pretty unlikely that the Fed raises rates again tomorrow. I would be even more surprised if they were to come out and cut, given that we are not to their 2% goal at this point in time. So I think that's highly unlikely. The market is, again, as Paige was talking about, they're expecting pretty significant rate cuts next year, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I think, to most of the staff here, because I would agree you need to get into some kind of a more dramatic recessionary environment before I think the Fed would be willing to cut rates that many times, but we'll see. I've been wrong before. Haven't made a living out of predicting what the Fed's going to do in terms of rate moves, so keeping a close eye on it. Slide 6, employment, sort of the other side of the Fed's mandate. So their dual mandate to, sort of maintain full employment, but keep inflation under control. Those two things are often at odds, as they are now to some degree, raising rates in effect to try to probably slow employment down to a certain degree. And we had been seeing that happening. You can see, it's marginal, but we had been seeing the unemployment rate tick up a little bit over the last several months here, 9 months or so, I guess. Did come back down again in November. The unemployment rate was 3.7 for the November number that we just got a couple weeks ago. But that was somewhat elevated by the fact that we got a lot of the auto workers coming back into the number that were on strike prior, so arguably there was a little bit of noise in that most recent number. Anecdotally, I think we have seen some weakness perhaps, higher numbers of layoffs getting announced in the market. Part-time employment has been going down slightly as well, so we'll sort of see where this goes, but I think the Fed would like to see employment weaken probably a bit further in order to get inflation under control a bit more than they have at this point. Looking at slide 7, so this speaks to more the consumer side of things, but the household debt service ratio, see that chart in the upper left-hand corner there, it's come back up. You see the big dip that we had during COVID as all the stimulus money hit and people were able to, pay down debt and do other things because of stimulus checks. You've seen that rebound to something that would sort of approximate normal, I guess, prior to COVID. Similarly, delinquencies have ticked back up in autos and credit cards. Student loans haven't yet, but they were being deferred until September, so they're just sort of in the fourth quarter starting to come back online, and would probably expect to see delinquencies tick up there as well. And then over to the right, you can see, the decline in excess savings, so people spending down that stimulus money and things that sort of hit the system. So I think broadly, I would say the consumer is normalizing and, sort of see where it goes from here. But with the Fed raising rates and things too, I do think over time, a lot of those things will start to bite a bit more, and we might see deterioration in these metrics as we go forward. And then finally, slide 8. This is just kind of a slide I've seen from a number of our managers, and this is one that I got from JP Morgan's slide deck that they put out quarterly. So looking at that chart on the left-hand side there, you can see the top 25 banks, sort of the breakdown of their loan book. And notably here, commercial real estate for the top 25 banks is only 13%. Whereas next to that, the smaller banks, those below the top 25, it's 44% of their loan book. So, we've talked at length about kind of real estate, and obviously there's some pockets of the real estate market that are going to be in more of the distressed category. So I was just sort of thinking about, well, who's holding the bag and how might that ripple through the markets, and where should we have a little bit of concern? With the smaller banks holding more of that commercial real estate, it may be, I think there will be some tough conversations between borrowers and lenders here as we see some of those loans start to come due, some of the rate caps that they may have in place start to roll off. The borrower probably doesn't want to put more equity into an office building that maybe isn't as well occupied as they would like it to be, whereas the lender, would like to see that so that they've got better coverage, but they probably don't want that asset on their books either going forward. So, that may stress to some degree that portion of the balance sheet for some of the smaller banks. And at the same time, they're sort of getting hit on the other side of the equation as well, on the deposit book, where arguably, they have not yet had to fully pay maybe market interest rates for all of their deposits. And so they're sort of getting squeezed on all those sides of that equation. And so just an area where we're looking at it and thinking about, a place that might have some stress, and does that, ripple through it into either anything that we own, or could it be a more systemic issue over time? I tend to think it's probably not systemic, given that the top 25 are probably in better shape, and those would be the more systemically oriented banks. But, we saw with Silicon Valley Bank and others earlier this year that sometimes those things can kind of catch fire, and something I think we need to be aware of going forward.
Do you know what percentage are lent out to their deposits?
It varies a lot from bank to bank. I don't know what the average is.
The numbers I'm seeing are way lower than what they would normally be.
They're certainly pulling back.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean,
So
when
it's
you look at
very
those,
difficult to get any borrowing done on any current deals. There's no doubt about that. So they're definitely.
they're less than 40% lent out, a lot of them,
Yeah.
at least the banks in Montana, so.
Yeah, and that may vary a lot by geography and So this is a very broad brush here for sure.
On, some of our investments are in preferred securities, and most of those, I think, are bank securities, I
A
think.
lot in financials there. Yes.
But anyway, does that have any implication from talking about the preferred?
You know, most of those would be in sort of the top 25, or all of those would be in the top 25 banks, or at least in the, top 25 global banks, let's put it that way. So I don't think so. We did obviously have, we took a little hit with the Credit Suisse stuff in the preferred portfolio. So I wouldn't say that, there's no impact there, but, or potential for impact, but it's not something that keeps me up at night to a great degree.
What does keep you up?
The
Financially.
executive director when he texts and calls me.
Markets are
And I
okay.
would say they're also higher in the capital stack in terms of the equity gets hit much harder and first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So if no other questions on the economic environment, I'll roll into sort of the assets under management here. So slide 9, total assets at BOI, a little less than 26 billion. Per member Youngkin's request at the board training, we have employed a new color scheme here, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to read for everybody, but welcome your feedback there if you have any.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Matt. Matt did it.
Thanks, Matt.
Slide 10, assets under management by participant type. Really nothing major to point out here, pretty similar to what it has been. Slide 11, net asset value. Again, pretty much steady as she goes. You can see a little bit of a decline in the overall assets within the STIP portfolio, the top blue line there. But that was expected. I think I should message that in the past, probably declines a little bit more as we go forward, but huge change there really. Slide 12, pension asset allocation. We're well within all of our approved ranges. We were a little bit lower away from the midpoints prior to the rally in November, which pushed us maybe back towards those midpoints, but broad strokes, we're still underweight public equities, both domestic and international, overweight private investments and real estate, and generally trying to be a little bit overweight cash as I can keep it around at any rate. I don't have to send it out for some other purpose. Slide 13, pension asset allocation. Again, similar to what you see quarter after quarter, diversified across the asset classes and within each of the asset classes. No major change or shift there really. Slide 14, the pension net performance in dollar terms. As always, the important point here really is that we are kind of consistent with what maybe Dory and Sean and things were saying, is that we have managed to earn substantially more than we've needed to pay out in benefits, particularly over the longer time frames, but even over the 1 year here. And so that's certainly a strong positive. And then looking at pension performance in a percentage terms on slide 15, good performance over all the longer time frames here, generally in excess of our actuarial hurdle rate. Fiscal year to date, performance as of last Friday was about 1.6%. So as Paige has kind of noted, we rebounded for the fourth quarter here so far, had a negative return in the third quarter, but we've had a strong performance in November. That helps significantly. Questions about anything in the pension portfolios before I move on? All right, seeing and hearing none. Looking at assets under management outside of pension, slide 16, about 12 billion there. Again, no real big shifts in the players or the amounts here overall. Slide 17, diving into STIP. couple of points here. So the weighted average maturity in the portfolio up at 63 days at quarter end. That's probably about as long as we've been, or as long of maturity as we've had in STIP for quite some time. Simply Kirsten taking advantage of some of the higher rates that we saw during the third quarter. She was getting 1-year paper up at 6% or better. So that's been nice as rates have come back down a little bit better. So good timing on her part there. And current STIP yield is approximately 5.4% as of yesterday. It's been hovering right around that ballpark for a little while now. Yeah, that's kind of it on STIP there, I guess. STIP performance on slide 18. Continue to have good performance over all the time frames here. Nice to see the pop and STIP, of course, compared to, it's interesting looking at like the 10-year return at 1.25 and now sitting at 4.6 plus. Pretty big change there, which I know that all of our participants are certainly enjoying. Questions on STIP? All right, moving to the trust funds pool. Slide 19, again, well within all of our asset class ranges there. Maybe the one thing to note here was we have been getting some capital calls in real assets. We got one significant large one last week actually for ITE Rail, if you recall that one. So that's the one that is the, with the manager, we own rail cars, lease out those rail cars to a variety of corporations. So they did a large merger and called down all of that capital for both the pension, trust fund, and state fund. So that'll add about 1% to our overall asset allocation to real assets within trust fund, which you'll see next quarter when we put these numbers together. Performance on slide 20. So I would point you to the bottom of the slide here, the yield portion of that table. You can see the 1 year at 3.76%. So essentially, we've talked about it before, the trust fund participants, they really care how much cash flow am I getting? How much, can I spend this year on the programs? That's been ticking up as we, obviously had a negative impact to performance. Interest rates go up, the value of the bonds go down. However, as those bonds roll off at those lower interest rates, we're then able to put those back out at the much higher rates. So we're starting to see that effect, pushing up the yield a little bit that the participants get in trust fund. So again, a nice benefit for them over time, which we would expect to continue as we're able to put more of those bonds that roll off to work at higher levels. Questions on trust fund? Okay. Rolling forward to state fund, again, well within all of our approved asset class ranges here. I would note down at the bottom of that slide, the cash equivalents up at 3%. That's probably a bit higher than we are typically. That is because, as you know, state fund pays an annual dividend typically. It was $35 million this year. So these numbers are as of the end of September. And the dividend payment went out in October and November. All completed now, but that cash number was a little bit elevated as we anticipated needing to have some funds available for them to pay the dividend. And similar to trust fund, that capital call for ITE Rail in December, that'll be state fund's first investment into real assets, and it'll be about a 1% position for them. Once that gets called out, or now that it has gotten called out. State fund performance on slide 22. Good performance across all the time frames versus the benchmark here. Not too much else to say about it, but any other questions on state fund? I think we did have a meeting with them 2 weeks ago, I guess, just with staff. In good shape there. Good conversations with Kent and Renee, and it's going well. All right. Slide 23, CIO update here. So Federal Reserve, we talked at lengths here about the rate hikes. A little cautious on our outlook, I would say. You know, I don't know if I'm skeptical. We've gotten increasingly good information that the economy is slowing, and yet we are not in a recession. You know, they're striking that knife's edge balance, I guess, so far. But still, I don't know that the rest of the story's been written here, and so mindful of our cash needs in particular for benefits and capital calls. We have been in a place recently here, you know, probably for the last 9 months or more, where distributions from our real estate managers or our private equity managers have really slowed down. In other words, there's not a lot of transaction activity. They're not returning capital to us right now. And yet, there are some of them that are making pretty large capital calls, like the ITE rail, because they see opportunities in the market. And ultimately, that's a good thing, because we think these will probably be some very good vintage years with some of the people that are pulling down capital right now, but we need to be prepared for that and able to meet our obligations. So keeping cash a little bit higher, or at least trying to, so that we can make sure that we meet all of those obligations as we go along. Been working with the executive director a bit on some analysis for the study commission on pensions. Talked about a lot of the annual report stuff this morning, did all the annual letters there and the management discussion and analysis for the unified investment pool and all of that good stuff. So happy that we got all that done and out of the way. We also talked about the SEC lending stuff for STIP, and thank you very much for approving that policy change for us. I think that will be additive to the portfolio overall. We posted for our investment and accounting interns for next summer. I guess that was like in November, if I recall. Kirsten and Rob went down and presented to the MSU Finance Club and did a fine job from all reports. You will maybe recall that Rob was an intern of ours from MSU previously, so I think they were all happy to hear from him, and thanks to them for doing it, because I was supposed to go down with them, but wasn't able to with some other obligations, so they kind of took the reins and took over there. And happy to come to Tech as well. I've offered to Tim and
We'll make that
and
happen.
others, so come down and do something similar anytime you want. And then finally, of course, you know, board training for those of you who are there, with a smashing success, with the one exception that member Peterson directed me to improve on my selection of taxi cabs. Whenever you go, you need to look and see, you know, how good the seats are and things, that the springs aren't coming out before you get in the cab. So I will endeavor to do better going forward on that. But with that slight hiccup, it went pretty well, didn't
I'll
it?
take wipes.
Take some wipes, yes. Happy to answer any other questions on yes.
Oh, just while you're talking about that training in Boise, just from a couple people that have been there, could you just on a high level say, was it worth it, or should we do it again, or additional things we should cover, or just throw it open?
Chairman President, I would say it was very worthwhile for me to go. I mean, I'm one of the newer board members, and I still look at a lot of charts that they provide, and the quilt chart is the biggest mystery to me, but I'm getting better, and I think it's some continued exposure to all of this stuff and more details, and eventually it'll all make better sense, but it was very worthwhile for me.
Yep, I would echo that as well. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot.
I think the more often you go through this stuff, particularly being a new one, you know, the more often you see some of that stuff, the easier it is to see how the picture fits together, you know, and how things are going. And it's been very helpful, the training I had to the meetings. I think it's been very, very good.
Even us oldies on the board, I think it was really helpful, Jack. I got a lot out of it, probably more this time than the previous one. because I was relatively new the first time and it made sense this time.
I thought that there was a lot of great discussion, had a lot of chance for interaction.
Is that
They didn't make me feel stupid.
the gluten-free donuts were delicious? Is that something we want to do annually? Is that something that every 2 is sufficient? Again, not something to answer today, but give me your feedback and if it's something you want to replicate more frequently, we'll build it into the budget and make it happen.
So sometimes it works good with travel, or sometimes it might work good in a meeting here, maybe even a separate meeting
Well,
every other year too.
here or Big Sky?
Did you remember that chart on travel we did?
Jim and I vote for that.
Dan, I might mention that, we did kind of a basic run through. It was pretty comprehensive and I'm glad the trustees enjoyed it. But there's no end to education. We learn stuff every single day. And there's a whole nother sort of second level that builds on that we could do as a sort of a curriculum. So for example, those statistics that you saw that Paige talked about, and she mentioned a couple of them like the Sharpe ratio, those are actually quite useful and quite instructive, but they're not intuitive. They're not obvious to understand. But a simple explanation with a few Q&As for 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 of those things might be helpful at some point, kind of varying, building on what we did last year. It's just an offer, but we can do it. I should say Paige can do it.
Thank you.
Something like that to where you do a deep dive into some of those, how the statistics tell us something, wouldn't be a bad idea from time to time, to where you get a better feel for what's behind that calculation and what it means.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you as a board and, we can always add education in when we're here, whether that's a 5-minute, quick, refresher on a specific chart or statistic, or if you want to have a 30-minute session on something, you just tell us what's of interest and we're happy to provide that.
I was on another board and they used that quilt chart. I was just glad to see they looked the same. Just saying.
Could you make us one?
Okay, well, with that, we'll defer to John and
Turn it over to Aaron.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'll just refer to this key takeaways page. Feel free to reference the graphs on the following pages if you'd like. Starting off with strategic asset allocation, all benchmarks, with the exception of the core fixed income benchmark, make positive contributions to the pensions policy neutral 5.7% return. I just point out here that we're looking at a 3-year attribution now. I have used to showing you a 1-year. With this 3-year attribution, this is really going to be the number that's going to change from quarter to quarter. The rest of these numbers are just going to marginally change. So if it kind of sounds like I'm bringing up the same points every time following this, that's the reason.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. So this is a 3-year attribution chart.
Yes, yep. So strategic asset allocation is going to be the main driver of our returns, right? So all the tactical style selection and manager selection are just marginally on top of that strategic asset allocation contribution. So they're going to change relatively small over these longer time periods. But with the major market returns that you see from the strategic asset allocation, that's going to be the one that we're going to see changing from quarter to quarter.
And that's why you're using a shorter term.
We like to look at these longer term ones, I
So
think.
But 3 years
These
is
are-
not a longer return.
But that's all the data we
Okay,
have,
yeah.
because this is a new metric we
Okay, got
implemented
it,
several
okay.
years ago.
Got it.
Yeah, and as we build more history there, we can look at longer term ones and the short ones if we want to see how things are changing now.
Yeah,
So-
I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but your staff is right. In the short term, the calculation is pretty accurate, but it's not terribly informative because it's short term. In the very long term, too many changes in cash flows and asset allocation along the way make it not as informative as you'd like it to be. The sweet spot, in our view, is kind of in that 3 to 5 year range, which is exactly what he's pointing out, where it's long enough to be informative, but it's not so long that changes in asset allocation over that long period and cash flows in and out of the portfolio make it somewhat unstable. So I'll stop there.
So moving on to the tactical asset allocation effects. So in aggregate, the overweighting and underweighting of the asset classes relative to their midpoints increased the pensions portfolio's return by about 8 basis points, which is small. I mean, we'd like to see that. We like to see these effects be small, positive or negative, right? I think this is a bit smaller than we'll see typically, but again, it's what we want to see. For style selection, I guess I'd point out here, as I think I did last quarter, that within international equity, there's a slight growth bias in the portfolio, which led to a slight underperformance of about 14 basis points. In real estate, our exposure to a CMBS index was the primary contributor to underperformance there. And I guess that's being compared versus a private real estate benchmark. And within non-core fixed income, exposure to our preferred and emerging market debt indices led to the slight underperformance there. And keep in mind, it's being compared to a high yield benchmark. In manager selection, the only thing I think I'll point out here is, once again, private investments was by far the main contributor, private equity specifically, this manager selection effects, which I think goes along with what Paige was saying earlier. The additional returns we're getting from our private equity managers specifically has been very accretive to the portfolio.
So a quick comment. We love this chart. We love attribution. And I can't stress enough how much we agree with your staff on that tactical asset allocation number being small as a contributor, whether negative or positive. And this is a great example of what we just discussed about, and a statistic that you see that you may not appreciate how much information it could convey to the board about the conduct of your investment program. If that number were like 1%, whether positive or negative, it would demand some scrutiny, because it would mean that there were deviations from your investment, your asset allocation targets that were so great that they moved the needle one way or another. And whether positive or negative, it's a question of whether or not that's the way you want to try to earn. You're trying to essentially earn returns. So this is a classic example that connects this offer of additional education with a statistic that you may not appreciate how much it can convey to you about how well your program is being executed by your staff.
So the question I have, just so I can gain understanding, in the short term, when we look at 3 months, quarter, you had earnings in real estate, had losses in other, that's gonna change your weighting. So by going longer term, that gets you a clearer picture. That is not the reason for the length, is because you wouldn't have that same effect as much, because you're gonna have moved some stuff to balance it.
Yeah, I think it's always good to look in the markets in that longer term perspective, because you're reducing a lot of that noise. The private equity benchmark is the classic example, right? Because the benchmark there is a public market benchmark, and private assets are going to be above or below that a lot in the short term. But on that longer term time frame, of course, we want to see an additional return there, and that's what we kind of expect.
Well, I was looking at our weighting, okay? In this quarter, we're heavily weighted, the ones that earned and the ones that lost were.
You're right, that there's a big element to the tactical, we call it tactical asset allocation, but in reality, to your point, a lot of times it's not. So in other words, we are away from our midpoint. We're below the midpoint in domestic equities and international equities, maybe partly because I have had a slight view of being underweight there, but largely it's been because of market moves that took us away from there, right? And so that piece of it, you know, is not.
But when we get to
volatile.
3 to 5
When we get
years,
to 3 years, it probably smooths out because we've
Yeah.
gone through some ups and downs in the market. But, you know, yes, you know, we're gonna be away from our, you know, they're really not a target, but the midpoint of the range, which is how Aaron calculates this. You know, we'll be away from those midpoints simply because the market moved on any given day or quarter or whatever. So, yeah, absolutely.
just wanted to see if I was seeing it right.
So, any other questions? Thank you. I will pass it on.
Jim, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'll be starting on page 27 with domestic equities. So US stocks took a bit of a breather in the third quarter, as you've heard, but still have had a strong run for the past year. The market is intently focused on economic data. Anything that might suggest the future path of interest rates has been a driver of market more recently. So when the market fears higher for longer interest rates sell off, and we've had a bit of a reversal of that here in the fourth quarter, and stocks have rebounded. But over the last year, declining inflation, a surprisingly resilient economy, and optimism around AI have been fueling a strong rally in stocks. As we've mentioned before, that rally has been heavily concentrated in a small number of names. These are largely mega cap growth stocks, which have become known as the Magnificent Seven. I guess the passing of the FANG stocks, which was 4 stocks, you get 7, it's harder to come up with a cute acronym. So we're stuck with Magnificent Seven for the time being. But so while small cap and value stocks have risen over the last year, they've lagged these mega cap stocks by quite a large margin. Turn to page 28. As a reminder, we are 100% indexed or 100% passive in domestic equities. So the differences in our sector exposures are very small. And as we've mentioned in prior board meetings, we've maintained a modest overweight to small caps in our domestic equity portfolio. Page 29. So PE ratios in the third quarter declined and come off the peaks that we saw earlier this year, but still remain above longer-term averages. So the outperformance of the Magnificent Seven stocks has had an outsized impact on market valuations, as these stocks trade at a premium to the rest of the market as a point of reference. So the top 10 largest stocks in the S&P 500 trade at around 26 times earnings, and the rest of the market trades at around 17 times earnings. It gives you a perspective of the impact of those larger stocks. Any questions about domestic equities? Moving to page 30 with international equities. As in the United States, international equities sold off in the third quarter, still enjoyed a strong rally over the last year. The dynamics in international markets has been a little bit different, with international small caps performing about in line with large caps. But the biggest difference coming in that international value stocks have outperformed growth stocks for the last 12 months, which was the opposite of what we've seen here in the United States. With respect to emerging markets did outperform in the third quarter slightly, but this is reversal from what we've seen over the last year, where emerging markets have underperformed by a significant amount, by a little more than 10% over the last year compared to developed markets. Performance of our active managers, I would say, has been mixed. There's not been a discernible pattern between value managers or growth managers. And I just add a note on active management. Active management tends to do better when the market's focused on earnings and cash flows, as opposed to interest rates, geopolitics, other large macro factors like we've seen really over the last couple of years. Page 31, starting in the upper left-hand corner, you see a very slight overweight to emerging markets. We tend to really be neutral with our exposure to emerging markets. As a reminder, This positioning is determined by the sum of our managers' decisions. This is not something that we are actively managing ourselves. In the bottom left, as we have in the United States, well, international, we have a modest overweight to small caps. In the bottom right, you see the split between active and passive, which is tilted a little more towards active at the end of the third quarter. If you recall back earlier this year, we increased that exposure to active slightly. If you rewind back to the end of 2022, that split was roughly 50-50. Page 32. So while valuations have increased this year for international stocks, the ACWI ex-US index still trades at a discount to its 20-year average. And as we mentioned before, and you see here, a very large discount to US equities, roughly 30%, which is a historically very high level of discount. Any questions about international equities? Moving to non-core fixed income, it's on page 33. Strong returns for the asset class over the last year, where emerging market debt has been the strongest performer, followed by US high yield. Preferred securities have lagged this year, largely due to the pressure in the banking sector that we saw in the first quarter. For US high yield, lower quality credits have outperformed this year, which I think we mentioned a little bit and talked about this too at the deep dive back in August. Not a great environment for our managers who tend to be more conservatively positioned. So when lower quality credits rally, that tends to be a drag on relative returns to our high yield managers. Page 34. So some of these difference in characteristics, you look at sector differences, that and the credit rating exposure differences. These largely come from exposure to our non-US high yield strategies, which have different exposures. So if you look at emerging market debt and preferred securities, they have a significant component which are investment grade. And in terms of sectors, we talked about preferred securities, heavy exposure to financials, that you see in the difference too. And within emerging market debt, these are foreign government bonds. They're not in the benchmark at all because the benchmark is our US high yield, which is a corporate bond index. So that explains the difference there in terms of sector exposures and rating exposures. Page 34. US high yield spreads have traded in a relatively tight range compared to 2022. I would say that level is not extremely wide, which would indicate market stress or necessarily overly tight, but at least at the end of the third quarter, tending a little bit more towards tighter than the long-term average for spreads. Similar to US stocks, when the market fears higher for longer interest rates, spreads tend to widen, as they did when stocks sold off late in the third quarter. But absolute yields for US high yield have been at 8% or in excess of that recently, which is a welcome change from some of the low yields we experienced pre-COVID when interest rates were extremely low. The default rates have increased a little bit, but still remain below long-term averages. And looking at the health of the market, the portion of the US high yield market that's trading at distressed levels is relatively low. And so we talked about in the asset class review back in August about some of these attributes of the high yield market that are different than in the past: higher credit quality, currently higher yields, a dollar discount, which is something that you don't usually see with these other attributes. And issuance has been very slow this year, so there's a technical a tailwind that money goes into the market into high yield that's going into fewer bonds than previously. Any questions about non-core fixed income? Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome, Ethan.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Members of the board, I will be covering real estate and real assets, starting off on page 36, where we'll see the ownership breakdown by assets under management, dollar value add, performance, and a couple of bullet points I've brought to your attention. Lots been said on real estate today. Key takeaway, very dislocated market. Transaction volume is down significantly. Price discovery is still very much an active term in the market. Financing markets, while open, are still very tight and only really open for the right deals. I expect with the elevated interest rate environment and continued pressure on cap rates, we'll continue to see some downward performance trickle into the portfolio. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have.
You're saying it'd be harder to get out of that market right now if you wanted to reduce some stuff? Because people aren't interested in the market, you'd have to take a hit to get out?
Yeah, absolutely. In general terms, that's 100% correct. Of course, every asset has a price. It's got to be the right deal, but liquidity is very much constrained. I would characterize this as very much a capital markets driven sort of downturn versus fundamental downturn. While fundamentals have been decelerating and moderating, they're still relatively healthy and have come down to sort of more normalized rates. But very much an interest rate, cap rate, capital markets, debt financing driven market right now, and hard to exit.
We're out of favor of basically the people investing right now.
In favor of the buy side, absolutely. The sellers are having a hard time rationalizing the fact that their assets are now worth less, for sure.
In all sectors?
Some more so than others. You know, the darlings of the past, the multifamily, the industrial, maybe some of the more niche-y stuff, self-storage, medical office, a little bit more in favor than office, generic commodity office, maybe malls. Grocery anchored infill has definitely launched itself out of the overall sort of retail classification, and people are recognizing it as sort of a needs-based, steady Eddie bellwether through good times and bad. People need to eat. So it just depends on the market. Lots of variability by market, by property type, for sure. Any other questions? Seeing none, I'll direct your attention to page 37. I'll just note in the upper left, we're within all of our policy constraints. You see our diversification in the upper right and the history of our commitments and cash flows through time down on the bottom. I'll just note that this is a reflection of our private asset holdings only and does not incorporate any of our public holdings. Any questions here? Seeing none, page 39, very straightforward, no new commitments since last we met. Working on a couple right now, however, which I hope to tell you about maybe in February. Turning to page 40, unless there are other questions, we'll tackle real assets. Where we see the AUM breakdown, dollar value add, the performance. Lots going on in real assets, a lot of differentiated investments within there. I won't read these bullet points, but to the extent you have questions about managers or anything specifically, I will certainly address them head on. Moving on. Page 41, again, within all policy constraints, private assets represented only in the bottom chart, and our diversification in the upper right-hand corner. Questions, concerns? I'm at your disposal. Seeing none, we'll move on to page 42. I've presented these graphs in the past. Oil is a portion of our real assets exposure, perhaps a significant one. There's been a lot of volatility there. There's a lot going on in the oil markets, a lot of volatility, unrest in the Middle East. Supply seems to be picking up. You've got continued OPEC plus cuts, record high production in the US, recession, maybe not in the US, certainly in China. So just a lot of volatility, a lot of macro driving price fluctuation. In terms of lumber, a lot of volatility there, huge price swings during the pandemic. We've settled back in as housing starts have dropped off, interest rates have picked up, people aren't remodeling, building chicken coops in their backyard, that sort of thing. So moderating for sure. Any questions there on any other assets? Sorry.
Build a chicken coop.
I did not. I was tempted. I was at Home Depot one day. I saw the price of lumber and said, no way.
My friend just finished one.
Moving on to page 43, we've got two new commitments to discuss, both to the same manager, EQT, however, different strategies. EQT is an existing manager. We've been in their Infrastructure 5 fund. We re-upped in Infrastructure 6 in their Active Core fund, which is a new strategy for them. Both are very much sector-focused, thematic approaches that have the benefit of 130 infrastructure-focused investment professionals located in, I believe it's 23 offices around the globe. They're also supported by over 600 industry executives that they have as their sort of part of their proprietary industry advisor network that they have sit on portfolio company boards. They're former executives, former operators, CEOs, et cetera. If we think about the two next to each other, Infrastructure 6 versus Active Core, think Infrastructure 6 is very private equity, value add, shorter term holds, 5 to 8 years, higher expected returns, more active management, more focus on more global focus. So they will look, and they have made Asia Pacific investments in addition to North America and Europe. The Active Core will be very long-term holds. It's a 25-year fund. I think asset liability matching in terms of a pension scheme, more stable, highly contracted, visible cash flows with inflation escalators, more yield oriented, and will primarily be focused on North America and the and Europe, pardon me. Anything else to add there? I would say not specifically, but happy to answer any specific questions.
Their headquarters is in Stockholm, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Just the way they look at analyzing different things, is it all similar, or do they have a unique perspective versus US analysts?
Their underwriting process is very repeatable, applicable across geographies. However, I would say that when looking at various local macro, that definitely comes into play, no doubt about it, and that would manifest itself in nuanced tweaks within each investment memorandum and discussions, certainly at the IC level, but otherwise very disciplined process applied across geographies and deals. Did that answer your question, Jack?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, great.
I just note that when we used to interview these people, they always said they were disciplined.
Well, without a disciplined investment process, I think you're lost, quite frankly. So nice to know that not only the MBOI and its staff, but the folks that we tend to partner with long-term, that's a critical aspect and something we deeply focus on.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. Great, cheers.
Well, I even have
Yeah,
one
sure.
question. Are these EQT, the Active Core Infrastructure primarily, is this a new placement? I mean, it's new for them too?
It is new for them too. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Yep. Nothing further? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Thomas Winkler, Director of Private Investments. Real quick update, quarterly update on the private investments asset class. As you can see on slide 44, page 44. And remember, we're in cap only, about 2.5 billion in assets under management. The performance table, I always like to highlight the longer term frame. It is the most meaningful in this asset class, given the nature of it. We are performing within expectations and outperforming quite handsomely the 5 and 10 year benchmarks. So that's our big goal there. Some markdowns in the portfolio, as you probably saw in the press, primarily limited to the venture capital type investments where we have a smaller portion in the portfolio, so not as impactful in our investments. Are there any questions? I'll move on to page 45 and the characteristics, well within the guidelines, within the limits, the breakdown in the top right-hand pie chart. If you recall our discussion from October, we walked you through all of these sub-asset classes in great detail. Happy to answer any questions there. Just wanted to make one note on the domestic versus international donut chart, I guess it's called. You guys know we have a 30% limit on international exposure, so we're about halfway there. Just as we discussed also in October, we do look strategically to allocate outside of the US, and most likely we'll have 1 to 5 names or so to bring to the board in the next year or two. We actually did have if you remember from the October meeting, a market mapping exercise for the UK, and we have one of the managers that came out of that one for you to present here this afternoon. If there are no questions on that particular page, I'll move on to 46. Just a quick overview of valuations, and again, nothing dramatically shifts or is new here from quarter to quarter. We've seen a slowdown from the peaks of the COVID pandemic, primarily driven by deals that have gotten smaller and GPs or managers have gotten more selective. So good quality, smaller deals are still getting done. However, there's less money being placed into those. And primary reason, as you're all well aware, is the interest rate that's driving the cost of capital up for our managers. So debt or leverage is harder to come by. Deals are getting smaller by default. They're easier to finance that way. And you see that reflected in the right-hand side chart, the bars, that is the debt level, the average debt level on buyout deals that has come down and is below a 10-year average now for the first time in a very long time. Any questions on that particular page? If not, I'll move on to 47. Those are the new commitments for the fiscal year to date. You see 3 on the list, which puts us on roughly $195 million committed fiscal year to date. And I'll actually hand it over to my co-worker Ian, and he'll walk you through the board briefs, unless there is any other comments, questions. Seeing none.
Thanks, Thomas. Good afternoon, board members, chairman. My name is Ian Horwood. I'm here to present the new fund commitments that we've done this fiscal year. As Thomas mentioned, we have 3 to present today. If we turn to the next page, you'll see, we'll kick things off with Neuberger Berman. Co-investment Fund 5, BOI, we committed $75 million to their 5th fund. Neuberger has a large fund-to-fund, which invests primarily in mid-market private equity. This fund invests in the co-investment deals that spin off of that fund of funds. And just really quickly on what a co-investment is, a private equity GP will have a max size of an equity check that they're willing to write in a fund. And but oftentimes they'll come across deals that are a little larger, and they'll take that extra equity and they'll hand it off to their LPs. You typically at no fee, no carry. So it's a pretty attractive deal. So this fund invests in those co-investment deals that come off of their main fund relationships. We like this strategy because it's much cheaper exposure to private equity. In this fund, we're paying 90 basis points and 10% carry, which is quite a bit lower than the typical 2 and 20. So in short, this is a re-up to a firm we know well. We've been in all of their funds 1 through 5 now, all the way back to 2006. That's Neuberger.
They're so big, are they easy to deal with?
Yeah, I think we have a really strong relationship with the 2 Davids that run the strategy, David Morse and David Stoneberg. A lot of, I think, newer LPs, their experience might be different, where they do have investor relation folks and business development people that they deal with, but the 2 Davids, they call on Thomas and I directly still, so it's been a really good relationship. Good. Yeah. Okay, nothing further on Neuberger. Next page, you will see Kester Capital Fund 3. So this is the new UK manager. we committed 40 million British pounds or 50 million USD to the strategy, to their third fund. So a new relationship to us. We walked through the due diligence process in the October deep dive and how we map the market and then ultimately diligence the strategy. Kester, they buy lower mid-market companies in the UK and Ireland. They specialize in healthcare and technology. And these are small businesses that they buy directly from the founders and owners, not from other private equity firms. We like this strategy because buying from owners and founders, and especially at this size, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of ways that the private equity manager can add value, and we think can ultimately drive higher returns in this market segment. So that's Kester Capital. So if there's no questions on Kester, I'll move to the third and final commitment. Last but not least, we also committed to McCarthy to their 8th fund, a $70 million commitment. This is a re-up for us. We're in their funds 6 and 7. McCarthy, they invest in the lower mid-market, primarily in the Midwest. They're more of a generalist. They'll buy in a variety of sectors such as healthcare, business services, technology, or consumer. We like these guys because they've stayed consistent to their strategy over the years. They stick to what they know, and you can see they've had some home runs in Fund 6. I'll point you to the IRR. It's currently about 50% IRR. A lot of that in DPI as well. So Fund 8 really is just a continuation of the same team, the same strategy, and it's probably one of the higher conviction names that we have in the portfolio.
So the IRR will continue?
Well, yeah, sure. It'll likely drop off. We're a lot more focused on the cash-on-cash multiples and the DPI. It's currently marked at 2.2. So we expect that to grow as they sell more of their companies. Yeah, great firm. So that's McCarthy and the 3 commits we've done this fiscal year to date. So happy to go into more detail.
Questions?
If not, I'll pass it off to the great John Romosco.
Almost the end.
Yeah, he needed that intro.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Ian, and members of the board. If I could refer you to slide 48. A little bit of good news, bad news situation there. The good news is we, at the end of that quarter, saw yields on the index north of 5.25%. So that should provide meaningful income to participants and even meaningful contribution towards our bogey in the pension. The bad news is to get to that, bond prices fell and took away most of that north of 5.25% return. So you can see the results there in the 1 year where we saw just modestly positive returns. Another piece of bad news is you'll note that we're underperforming the benchmark on the 1 year by a small amount. The reason is because we were long duration to the index as rates were rising, and that made us more exposed to the rising rates than the index. We were about 10% higher exposed to interest rate than the index, and so if you do your arithmetic, we saw the yield of the index go up 68, 70 basis points, about a 6-year duration, about 10% long. That's your 41, 42 basis points of underperformance that you see in the trust fund. The additional 10 or so basis points of underperformance that you see in pension was because we were light corporate exposure in the pension fund, and that's an intentional underweight that we have, thinking that the value of the core internal bond fund is to offset some of the risk of the pension fund. And so John and I have a handshake agreement that we're going to run about 75% of the index in corporate exposure. So that small amount.
Any questions on the performance? Oh, I should probably mention state fund. Of course, state fund dramatically short its current index at about 88% of the index. Please keep in remember that we switched indexes during the year from the intermediate to the much longer egg. And so that resulted in better performance. It was short the index as rates were going up. And looking at our characteristics of the portfolio, core income, we're a little north of 110% of the index in duration, a little better than the index in our yield to worst. So that's a little bit counterintuitive that if we are long the index with an inverted yield curve, we should be underperforming in terms of yield to worst, all other things being equal. Where we're getting that outperformance, that additional yield is through our agency exposure, where we're out yielding the index. That's primarily because we bought callable agencies that yield a significant amount over and above bulleted agencies. And then additionally in mortgages, we were judicious about buying mortgages when the spreads were tight and only buying them when we felt there was a good opportunity in spreads. And so that's helped us build a yield advantage there. Those same dynamics are true in the trust fund and in the state fund as well. Any questions? Thank you.
I just have one question. That new title you just got, do I have to call you that now?
I'm not aware of the new title, but they come. Great. Well, I mean, I'll leave that up to you, but certainly not in lieu of compensation.
All right, Dan, we got through the day better than I expected. There was a lot to do today. We covered a lot. Before we do the recap, is there anything else that anybody has that we should look at or want to see? Okay, hearing none. Dan?
Only thing I've got is we will post the meeting for December 21st at 1:30 over Zoom for the workforce housing proposal.
That should be fairly quick, right?
If we do 20 minutes, I didn't have a very good explanation today.
You didn't have a very good explanation.
I thought you did, so that's why I said that.
And then otherwise, we'll get together again February 28th.
Based on history, you're guaranteed 20 below at that day.
Well, we're all.
Paige is like, yeah, Jim can come to that one. Otherwise, that's all I have.
Okay, anything else? If not, I appreciate everybody coming and thank you, everybody on Zoom, and meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.